Hey guys, welcome back to another Shep Talk Movie Vault review. Today's movie coming out of the vault is 2001 A Space Odyssey. But before we get into that review, just one admin note. If you like what you see here, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I am trying to get this channel to 100 subscribers, and everything you guys do helps me out greatly, and I truly appreciate it. Quick synopsis. A mysterious black monolith appears on the moon, and a spaceship is sent out to Jupiter to find its origins. As always, guys, the first question I answer whenever I do a review from the movie vault is, have I seen this movie? And the answer on this one is going to be no, but I have seen clips of this movie. The quotes for this movie is, out there. I've said them myself. But when I was watching this movie, I came to the realization that I'd never seen this movie in its entirety, or at least all in one sitting. 2001 A Space Odyssey was released on May 12th, 1968. It is directed by the great Stanley Kubrick. It stars I'm going to butcher these guys' name. Let me just say his last name, Dula. K. Dula, something like that. I'm sorry, I'm butchering his names. As Dr. Dave Bowen. It also stars Gary Lockwood as Frank Poole. And it also stars the voice of Douglas Rain as HAL 9000. One of the first things I thought of when I started watching this movie was that my TV must be broken. For the first 3 minutes of this movie, it is nothing but darkness, and even the music takes a long time to ramp up. And I will admit, I did fast forward through this movie a little bit just to make sure that my TV settings were all right, because again, this movie opens up for the first 3 minutes in pitch darkness, and it even takes the sound a while to get, to ramp up. I guess the main question of this movie, is why did the Black Monolith show up? Was it watching the evolution of humankind? Was it doing experimentation on humankind? Especially back in the early days when the apes/early humans touched the monolith, it seemed to give them intelligence. Was that the monolith doing that? That's like one of the main questions I have about this movie. Because I asked this question because when it looks like when the apes/early humans touched the monolith, they quickly figure out how to use tools. The bones of dead animals they quickly use as a tool, and of course they quickly evolve that into using it as a weapon to get, I guess, the only watering hole in this area that they previously couldn't get to because the other tribe had more numbers or was just stronger. I will say this right up front. I know Stanley Kubrick is a great movie maker. He has some visually stunning films out there, but one of the complaints I'll have about this movie is his transitions, especially that from the early human to when we get to the future 2001. It just seems very abrupt, and especially the way he likes to use music and sound and pictures. It just seemed to go like that, and it kind of was a bit jarring. It's one of my complaints that I'll have about this movie. I'm sure you'll see my thoughts later on about some of the other stuff that happens in this movie. One of the things I thought, I won't say funny, but it was kind of ironic, was the Pan American space shuttle. And it wasn't because Pan American is no longer with us now, but the simple fact that in this day and age, it is the private sector that is really putting the money forward for space exploration. The government has pretty much cut NASA off at I won't even say the knees, it's more like the hips. And our space exploration has been pretty much grounded to a halt as a government-funded agency. And we are seeing other private sectors, like SpaceX, stepping up and showing us that it is viable to go back into space and do what we want to do up there. And I will make another note. It isn't until the 24th minute and 40th second that we do get our first human word or human speaking on screen, which I guess isn't a big deal if you're coming into a Stanley Kubrick film and you understand what he's trying to do. But if you're coming into his film, especially 2001 A Space Odyssey, cold, not knowing what to expect, having pretty much 25 minutes of dead air, and I won't say dead air, you do get the music and you do get ape sounds and stuff like that, but it really doesn't bring you into the movie. I know for me, a couple of times I was getting a little disinterested, a little bored, because it seemed too slow. It seemed like there wasn't enough happening, or we weren't giving enough information to keep us engaged in that film. So having 25 minutes of your 2 hour and 20-minute film was just it wasn't great. Okay. Which then leads me into my other points with, you know, not having a lot of dialogue in this movie even after the 25th minute mark, was that Stanley Kubrick gives us these long establishing shots, and they're beautiful, don't get me wrong, especially when the Pan American Space Shuttle is docking on the space station, and even when one of the doctors heads to the moon. Those are beautiful shots. I think they might be a little too long. They were beautiful. The music really brought you into it. But again, in this day and age, I don't think they would have worked as well as they did back in 1968. I think, especially, I'm talking about the broad audience, not critics and people that have those film degrees, but for the standard audience, those shots probably would have been a little bit too long for them, and they would pull out their cell phones. And again, I think you guys might think I'm harping on the time, but again, at the 30-minute mark now, we get the first inkling of what the mystery of this whole movie is going to be about, where the doctor talks to some other pals, and they mention this mysterious place on the moon that got locked down, and certain things happen, but the doctor can't tell them what's going on, and no one really knows what's going on, which I kind of find funny in this day and age too. This movie got me thinking, because, this movie took place in 1968, talking about 2001. Now we're here in 2019. With all the technology that we have, all our phones, all our, having computers in our hands, if we did find a mystery on the moon, if we had these teams up there, and they were being run by the private sector, how well would the secrecy would have been? Could we keep a secret if we found like this black monolith on the moon in this day and age? Could we keep it a secret, especially if it's run by the private sector and not by the government? And speaking on that, this movie took place in 1968. It's very interesting to think or to see what they thought technology would be like in the 21st century in 2001. Some of the things that really stood out to me were the food boxes, especially when they're delivering them, on the space shuttle and stuff like that, all the liquid food. Because even in this day and age now, even when, we're eating solid food. So especially in, the International Space Station, and, even back in the 80s and 90s when we had space flights, it wasn't, liquid food. So it's just interesting to see that they thought that's the route that we would go for food. Another thing was the picture, the video picture phone booth, or what was it called? The picture phone booth. Because in this day and age now, right, we have our cell phones, which most people don't even use for calling anymore. It's usually, if we're doing calling, it's usually FaceTiming or video chatting. And the simple fact that they had this entire phone booth area to use for video chat. Maybe it's because, hey, we're trying to call back from a space station to Earth. But I think in this day and age, even once we get into space and we start having people in space stations and even on the moon, I think our phones will still be, the technology will be there. They'll definitely relay them. We'll still have a delay and stuff like that, but I don't think we'll be as reliant on a phone booth again as it was in 2001: A Space Odyssey. I will say too that the commercialization of space, like I talked about with the Pan American flight, you do see Hilton and a few other companies having a presence on the space station. Again, that's how I think we are going to be moving forward. The private sector is pretty much really going to be the one that drives us getting back into space, and it's going to be because of them that we have a presence on the moon and Mars and having space stations up, around Earth. And we probably will see something that says, Best Western or the Hilton or any number of companies that, give us a presence up there. And then we get another cut, which is about at the hour mark, where I think most people actually remember this movie. Like I said, I haven't seen this movie, or at least I don't remember ever seeing this movie in its entirety, but it seems like everybody that's doing a quote from this movie is doing it from this hour mark until the next pretty much cut. This is where we get Dave and Frank and HAL 9000 and their voyage to Jupiter to find the origins of the monolith. This is where we get "Good morning, Dave," or "I can't do that anymore, Dave," or or not, can't do that anymore. I can't do that, Dave. Or open the pod bay doors, Hal. Those kind of quotes is what we get. And I think that's what a lot of people remember about this movie, is that segment, and not per se the whole the movie as a whole. And speaking about Frank and Dave and how we get this scene where the government kind of tells Frank and Dave that they believe that their HAL 9000 is malfunctioning, or it calculated something wrong. And Frank and Dave start suspecting that HAL might be doing things it shouldn't be doing. So they decide to go to their pod and turn off their intercom so that way HAL couldn't hear them. But for some reason they turn the pod around where the only viewport that the pod has is facing one of the HAL interfaces. And of course HAL reads the lips of Dave and Frank, figuring out what they're up to. Even if Dave and Frank didn't think that HAL could read their lips, the simple fact that you're turning the pod to face HAL and give them that view into your pod really doesn't seem the best move if you are trying to not raise suspicion that you think something's going on. Oh, and one of the most annoying things in this movie is, I can't remember his Dave or Frank, I think it was Frank, when he does his space exploration walks, his heavy breathing. I don't know, could they not get an actor that could breathe right? Or is this part of the movie that Stanley Kubrick wanted because he wanted that sound? But oh my God, if I was Dave and my pal is out there walking, one, I'd tell me to, start breathing through your nose or something, or I'm going to mute you and I won't know if something goes wrong. But the breathing was just really getting to me, man. It just was really annoying. And it kind of irked me a little bit. It just annoyed me, and I had to make sure I hit on it. And then we get to pretty much the climax of this movie, even though it's not almost over yet. Hal decides he wants to live, he wants to preserve himself, because he knows that Dave and Frank are pretty much going to, remove him, pretty much turn him off from the space station. So one, which we don't really get addressed too much, Hal straight up murders the rest of the crew that's in hibernation on this journey. And he pretty much murders Frank as well. And then he comes on the intercom when Dave's trying to get back on the ship and tells him that, so I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that. Where, Hal's pretty much locked down the pod bay doors, not allowing Dave back onto the ship. Which brings me to my point. I know this movie was made in 1968, and I know robots and AI and electronics were not as well, it's not as prolific, spread out in humanity like it is nowadays. But the simple fact that there was no back door, no override switch built into the HAL systems, I know they said in HAL 9000, the HAL 9000 was kind of messing up, or the record was perfect until this point. But the simple fact that no engineer, nobody thought, okay, if something goes wrong on this voyage and HAL decides to malfunction and he has control over certain systems, why don't we put in a back door? Why don't we put in a voice override command? Just something that would protect the humans if this computer malfunction. Also along those lines, it seems like, I don't know, again, maybe it's just because in 1968 they didn't think about these things, but it seems like HAL didn't have a lot of control over a lot of the other systems on the ship. It could have been addressed, but again, this movie doesn't really explain a lot of things. And HAL 9000 doesn't seem to have control over the pods when they're outside of his ship, doesn't have control over the airlocks when Dave tries to come into the ship, and it doesn't look like HAL has control of even doors and other systems that could stop Dave from, when he gets into the ship, trying to stop HAL. Or trying to stop Dave. And speaking of pods, it seems like whoever built the ship had pods in mind when they built these airlocks, because it seems like the pods' arms were just the right size that Dave could use them to open up the airlock door without any trouble at all, even though, airlocks are not usually meant for pods. And then Dave is lucky once again too, because when he puts the pod against the open airlock door, he decides to pop the seal on his airlock, his pod door. The airlock isn't pressurized, and he just goes flying into the airlock, smacks that back wall, and he doesn't die. There's no way that if you did that in real life, that a human would be able to open his pod door, pretty much depressurizing his pod and smacking his head against, without protection, he didn't have a helmet on, smacking his head against the back of the wall. And then we get to the point where Dave is pulling the memory cards of Hal, from Hal, and Hal's being shut down. And I find it very funny that an AI like Hal is trying to plead for his life. He's trying to plead with emotional guilt on Dave. Of course, it's not working. Hal's pretty much killed his friend. And I don't know if Dave knew or not. He's pretty much Hal killed the rest of the crew. Excuse me. It's just one of those things that just seems, it was a little bit strange to see that Hal was okay trying to empathize, trying to use emotion to reach out to Dave. I don't know if it's just me or, I just don't get the ending of this film. When Dave finally does reach Jupiter, do the aliens keep him alive? Are they putting him up in this built up room and taking care of him until the last day of his life? It's just one of those things that I don't know. Comment down below if you know. I haven't done much research. I don't usually try to do much research when I'm doing these reviews. I just want to give you off the cuff what I thought of this movie. So comment down below with your take on the ending of 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the aliens keeping Dave alive. Now I give it to Stanley Kubrick. This movie is stunningly beautiful. The scenery, the shots, the music. Stanley Kubrick put this movie together very well. It's just the first, second, and even the fourth acts of this movie are too long, are not giving us a lot of detail, not giving us a lot of information. It's not until the third act, which I think is the act that everybody pretty much remembers when they watch this movie, that, that is the act that people remember. All the rest are forgotten unless you're dissecting this movie. But again, Stanley Kubrick does. This movie is a visual stunning masterpiece. It's just not something that everybody is really going to remember or pay attention to, especially, 30, 40 years later. And with that, guys, as you know, here at a Shep Talk Movie Vault Review, there's only two verdicts I give. Keep it or delete it. And sadly, I'm going to delete it. I do think 2001: A Space Odyssey is a movie that everybody should watch and at least enjoy what Stanley Kubrick was giving us. But I don't think it's one of those movies unless you're rewatching it for school, rewatching it for YouTube, or something that most people are going to revisit. As always, guys, thank you for watching, and I'll see you at the next review.